What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of the Well Man's Podcast. My name is Brian Brosey. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Keoni Tita. Keoni, how are you today?
Doing wonderful, everybody, for listening once again. Brian and I wanted to talk about a couple books that I read, and we're going to go through and I wanted to discuss them. And um, one of them is called Humankind. I highly recommend it. It's by Rutger Bregman. Um, and there's some other books that kind of follow that kind of theme of what's in humankind. We'll go over that. But it basically, if you read that book, this podcast, we're going to kind of follow that outline. Some other books of note. There's that kind of follows this a little bit, and I'll hit on is a book called Survival of the Fittest, and it's by Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods. I recommend two books, guys. And the reason why I wanted to kind of hit on these today is because I think we as humans have been raised to believe that our evolutionary past was built on survival of the fittest, kind of, beat your foes into submission to get to where we are, so to speak. Only the strong survive, and competition is the name of the game. The bullies kind of
End up winning in the
become the
long
winners.
run. Yeah.
End up winning in the long run, right? That type of thing. And speaking of the book Survival of the Friendliest, the book it talks about humanity, and it talks about research into dogs and domestication and what actually happens. And from an evolutionary perspective, humans seem to be, me and you wouldn't be here, Brian, if our ancestors basically, beat each other into submission and the stronger survived. I mean, pretty much you keep bashing people over the head, right? I mean,
So slowly you run out of heads to bash. Yeah.
Right. Whereas opposed to as we as humans as we came together in groups, and what brought us together in groups was the will to communicate, the will to cooperate, and what really happens in group dynamics, and what these books kind of bring to light, is that when you have a bully or like a dictator or a strong man, what eventually happens is they get ousted. They don't survive, and especially in small groups, that's a really big deal. And guess what happens from an evolutionary perspective? Their genes don't get passed on.
It's almost like you're talking about a certain political character.
Well, yeah, strong meditators and things like that, like their fall will happen if they are trying to bend people to their will and not cooperating with the group. But really, it speaks to something bigger than that, and it's like what got us to where we are. And so the main theme of this talk is not survival of the fittest; it's survival of the friendliest, as the name of the book, Brian Hare's book, implies. Is why did we as humans survive when there were a number of human or homo species that at one point in our history, they're saying there are at least 9 homo-like species that were highly intelligent? Why were we the ones that survived? And the story goes is that we basically beat them into submission, and we survived. Really what it comes down to is we as humans work really well in groups. We do really well working together, and we are generally overall a friendly bunch. We're not like this angry bunch that wants to just beat people into submission and yada yada yada. Now that does not mean that we cannot do some atrocious things to our fellow humans,
right?
But pretty much that is our default mode, and the reason why is because we are self-domesticated. And what I mean by that is, like dogs that are domesticated, we help domesticate them, but dogs also help them domesticate themselves. Through time, we became friendlier and friendlier, and we are no longer the savage that, it's like, the strongest survive, speak. And that's how we got to where we are today. So anyway, going back to that Humankind book, basically Bregman highlights a lot of myths that people think about. So, in the prologue of the book, they're talking about the one myth of bombing people into submission, and this was something that happened during World War II. And basically, this was what Germany wanted to do to Britain. And I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who actually lived through that, the bombing of London, daily. And what it actually did was it just hardened their hearts. They just went on about their lives and came together and were not bombed into submission and lost morale. It actually did the opposite of what Germany was intending. And then vice versa, when the Allies did that to Germany, the same thing happened. It just like kind of brought them together and people working together instead of just being bombed so much that they lost morale. I mean, one of the public signs that he talks about in here in Britain was like, well, okay, there's an actual sign that they said pubs are, that of somebody who owned a pub. Windows are gone, but our spirits are excellent. Come in and try them. So business ran as usual.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
So
interesting
that
to me. It's just interesting to me because I do think, one, my step grandmother also lived through those bombings in Liverpool. So just fascinating. And it's interesting to me how, as humans, when something negative is happening to us as a group, I feel like I agree with you. We definitely tend to kind of unite together around more or less a common foe, whether or not, that's a real thing. The foe is a real thing or an entity or whatever that may be against something. But then I also compare and contrast that with like the group mentality of like teenagers that are like ruthless. So I feel like you have two interesting dynamics there.
Yeah, so we should hit on that. And so do you remember the book or the story The Lord of the Ring? I mean, not The Lord of the Rings, The Lord of the Flies. Anyway, the story goes that a group of kids get shipwrecked on an island, right? And there's no adults on the island. And what ends up happening to them? Basically, they just default into savagery mode against each other, right? They become teams and they end up killing each other and yada yada yada. What's very interesting about that is that story was taken to be true. It was just the default was, yeah, we are at heart savages. But guess what? There was, I think it was in the 60s, there is a story, you can look it up online, and it's called the Togan Castaways. They were a group of 6 boys who, between 13 and 16, who in 1965 ran away from school. This is true now. On the island of Toga, stole a boat and became shipwrecked on a deserted island. They took a boat out, like they were just having teenager fun, and they got lost at sea. And they actually floated to a remote island called Ata, where there was nobody there. Some of these boys are still alive. Anyway, they're called the Togan Castaways. What they found is that these boys actually did not default into savagery. They formed very strong bonds. They used their critical thinking skills. They survived primarily on consumption of local birds and wild taro. I mean, these are 13 to 16-year-old boys. They all survived. They collected rainwater to drink. They were stuck for about 15 months. None of them died because they all worked together. So here's the real life story of Lord of the Flies, and it's nothing about what the book says happened. And psychologically, this is what seems to be the default. Here's another story. When Christopher Columbus came across and met the Native Americans, everywhere they turned, the Native Americans happened to be friendly. Everywhere they turned, there's no stories except in twisted scenarios where they're depicted as savages and being mean and want to kill them. What you are hitting on is something about what happens when you use propaganda and you use us versus them mentalities. And this is where humans really show their shitty side, right? when you have this us versus them group mentality and start saying our group is better than your other group. And
Right.
therefore now when you can start doing that and start dehumanizing other groups of people,
Hmm.
now you can start doing some really atrocious things.
Yeah.
So anyway, I recommend people look up that story. That's a true story, and it kind of debunks the real Lord of the Flies thing. So
And they made it out all
you
alive,
know,
like you were saying, back to home or whatnot.
oh yeah, and when they
Wow.
got home, when they were actually found. There's supposed to be a movie made out of it, and I think eventually a movie was made, but it never got any traction. Certainly not like the Lord of the Flies.
Hmm.
But some of these, I think most of them are probably all live right now. I mean, this is only in 1965, so.
Wow.
But yeah, they made it. They made it out alive and worked together. So it's a fascinating story. But speaking about what happens with propaganda in the media, here's another thing. This kind of hits home to us, right?
Mm.
Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. Um, you know, basically in the media, it devolved into, what's going to happen. People are running along the streets and looting and doing stuff, and mayhem is happening. And what the media did was actually made it worse and was not telling the whole truth about what actually was going on. Basically, it was put out there that New Orleans was overrun with self-interested people and anarchy. And because of that media response, what actually happened was it slowed down the rescue response to people get in, because there's a fear going on. Like, I can't go into that part of town because I heard there's roving gangs and stuff like that. And that was not necessarily true. And what they're really finding when looking back on this, when this all went down, most people in New Orleans were going around trying to help people, not going around trying to rob them and kill them and stuff, as but the media seemed to portray it as such.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that was the main.
I got a little dose of that this summer, Keoni, because I had a job interview and opportunity. It was may have been like a day, couple days after the Minneapolis situation, and everything was really unfolding with all of that. And it was in the peak of the
Yep.
coronavirus and all that. And we had to fly across the country to California. And this is when you're seeing clips on the news of people, stopping cars and traffic and whatnot and breaking in their windows in the middle of California and whatnot. And I remember
Right.
talking to Haley, we got on the plane and I was like, and we're all just sitting here just fine. Like, as one, I thought we're going to leave and holy cow, we better protect ourselves.
Right.
Da, 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 da. And you get there and everyone is, all creeds, colors, and everything is just sitting beside each other, moving along just as we typically would together. And the media
Right.
just portrayed it to be that way,
Yeah, the media is
or
part to
incited that
blame.
fear.
And
Yeah.
right, incited that fear, which maybe there's some truth, a small amount of truth to that. But in general, people are good and are going to do the right thing. And when you have
Right.
stuff like that, it slows down the response. And then it also puts police and people that are trying to put normalcy back into the emergency situation on guard. So, there's this story in Hurricane Katrina of these people crossing a bridge that looked like gang members, people of color, and some of them got shot. What they found out was they were shot by mistake, and it was basically out of fear,
Mm-hmm.
where these things happen. So the media is to blame a lot, and it puts this us versus them mentality, and when you start dehumanizing people's actions, like people looting, well, in general, the question has to be asked: why are people looting?
Right.
Do they just need to eat something, or are they just
Right.
trying to cause anarchy?
Right.
That's where we should go with things,
Yeah, absolutely.
before we start.
Should be listening
You
first and
know,
foremost.
right, right. So I think the whole thing start. There's a two kind of philosophers that were part of the Enlightenment age. One was Thomas Hobbes. He wrote the Leviathan, and the other one was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, said, basically humans need government and need like Big Brother to to act civilized, to keep us in. And without that, we default to our savagery. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau says just the opposite, basically, that humans actually need to get back to nature so they can get back to being, the good that they are, and that society actually makes us, more savage-like in what we do, where we, it's like, it's all
It's just more
about me,
cutthroat.
I need to climb. It's more cutthroat. Let me climb that corporate ladder, and it doesn't matter who I step on to get there, that type of thing. Um, what we're finding is, in general, I mean, there's some truths to both, but in general, Rousseau basically was kind of the one to bring the light that at our hearts, humans are generally good people, and he's basically saying it's really civilization that ruins us. I certainly wouldn't go that far. I mean, civilization is what got us to where we are. It's what got us to where me and you are doing this podcast. But look at the things that civilization can do to cause problems. And again, we go back to that us versus them mentality. My group's better than your group, therefore, I have the right to dehumanize you and then ultimately kill you if I see fit, And this is what happened with. And this is what happened with, when we colonized the Americas. We depict Native Americans as savages, dehumanize them, and so on and so on. And you know the gist of what happened to them. Talk about extreme annihilation. A lot of that was not generally due to, us just beating them over the heads. It was a lot of it. We brought our diseases over here that, wiped them out for the most part.
Yeah, as we tend to find, the answer or the truth always seems to lie somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it does. It does. But isn't it interesting, though, that our default does seem to swing back? It's no longer survival of the fittest. Humans are generally good. Deep down, we're generally good. Now, that's not to say that we can't do atrocious things, and we have throughout history, and we'll certainly talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But
it seems like desperation, and I think there's a saying, desperation breeds a beast or something like that, and it just, all these little situations can add up and kind of
fear does. Fear seems to do that, right? Yeah. But so there are other studies that went on. There's a guy named Samuel Marshall. He's a historian and colonel, and he's funny. There's a battle Macon in 1943. He was there on the scene to see what was going on, and he observed that only 15 to 25% of the soldiers fired their weapons in the Battle of Macon. And they said that kind of speaks to the humanity of people. Like they didn't want to be the ones to kill fellow human beings, so to speak.
Yeah,
it
or
was
you have
very
that example.
There's stories of
World War I where they met in no man's land on like Christmas night, and nothing happened.
Yeah,
I know
absolutely.
That's a very famous story, and that goes to speak specifically on the civilization aspect of it. Really, putting us at war with each other when, like you kind of alluded to there, no one really wants that.
Yeah, no one really wants that. And the people that wanted it was their superiors. You guys need to shoot people. But nobody's wants to do that. At the Battle of Gettysburg, what they found were muskets in the Civil War. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that much about firearms, but from what I understand, you get one shot and then you have to put in the barrel and stuff it down, and all this stuff, and then you shoot again. It takes it takes a while to shoot. What they found were some of these muskets were never shot and were double and triple loaded. One of them they found was loaded 9 times, never shot. You can't do that. The guy just kept loading and never shot. So loading a gun, and why would they do that? It's like the perfect excuse not to fire the gun.
Yeah, you look busy.
Sir, I was just loading. Yeah, I look busy.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that we as humans do that. In general, we're very good. And one of the hormones that kind of speaks to this is oxytocin. It's called the happy hormone. And you really get a boost of this when you're with people that you identify as being you. part of your group. On the other side of this hormone is an evil side, right?
Yeah.
As soon as somebody is identified as not being part of your group, this hormone no longer becomes the happy hormone. It helps make it the evil hormone, so it intensifies affection for friends and aversion to this hormone. So in the research, he speaks about it in the book. I found that fascinating that, we've talked about like fat loss and all that all goes back to hormones. Well, they found oxytocin seems to be implicated in this. So what do we find with our closest ancestors? So like chimps and gorillas and bonobos, these are our closest ancestors. What they find are chimps are generally a warring bunch of, primates, whereas gorillas are pretty much very peaceful, and bonobos are very peaceful too. And why? Because bonobos especially have self-domesticated themselves. When bonobos run into a group of other bonobos that they don't know, they all have an orgy pretty much. They all have sex and enjoy each other. And, there's no killing. There's never been a documented case of bonobos killing another bonobo, whereas there's been documented cases of chimps killing other chimps.
Yeah.
So there's something going on there where the self-domestication is huge. And you definitely see in domesticated dogs where, friendliness is basically selected over time. And they think this happened, like was it humans that domesticated dogs? Well, probably not. What probably happened is wolves, which dogs came from, probably followed roving bands of humans around and ate their scraps, ate out of the trash pile. And the ones that were the bravest, or the ones that were not adverse to strangers, would come and eat first. And then over time, you basically, those genes are passed on, and they become friendlier and friendlier. And eventually these friendly wolves are taken in as companions, and then they are bred for it to be more friendly,
Right.
And this experiment has been done to see how long it takes for something domesticated by a Russian scientist, and this was done in the 1950s, and it's still going on right now, named Dmitry Belyaev and Ludmila Trot. Anyway, these are Russian scientists who domesticated foxes. They're actually sold. These foxes prefer to be around humans. They're like dogs.
Wow.
They look like foxes, but they actually have certain signs of being domesticated, like very friendly faces. They wag their tails like dogs, whereas wolves do not. They have facial expressions that are more in line with us humans, who we've self-domesticated ourselves. We've passed on the friendly gene speak so that we can work in groups.
Yeah.
So we've done the experiments. We see what happens, and it's just fascinating as we became domesticated. There are some very interesting characteristics that came on with humans. I mean, one thing about humans and primates, especially bonobos, what you see is that they start being able to read the facial expressions of each other much better. And for us, right? I mean, you're really not human if you can't read a person's facial expression and get an idea right away about what they're thinking or what they're doing, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And the other really interesting thing about us humans, as opposed to other mammals, is we're very prone to putting ourselves in other people's minds, and we can see what they're thinking with their eyes. And one thing about our eyes that is very unique, we have sclera, or whites of our eyes. When you look at a human, you can tell where they're looking or where they're looking at because of the sclera or white. And a lot of other mammals, you don't see the sclera, you just see darkness, right? So you can't really tell where they're looking. Yeah. So that white sclera is part of, at least for humans, part of that self-domestication process. We lost our brow ridges also. Our faces became friendlier, so to speak. This is probably why when we look at puppies or dogs, we have similar facial expressions. We can look at each other and get an idea of what each other are thinking, interspecies.
Right.
And it's part of this self-domestication process. So And I just think it's something that we need to bring up, because I think in the time that we are living,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people will say things like, when you ask them, is, you know, if you're asked, and I think this was a study, are things getting better or worse in the world? Are you more optimistic or pessimistic? The vast majority say things are getting worse, or have a pessimistic view of things. And I think a lot of it has to do with this whole subconscious thing that it's the survival of the fittest, and it's the strongest takes all, so to speak. And also, I think the media plays on that, and
Yeah,
governments love to
absolutely.
play on that with their propaganda.
Yeah.
Whereas, me and you talked about this before. Is there a time in history where you would choose, other than now, to want to live? And I say no. I mean, right now we're living in the best time that we can live. I mean, diseases. I mean, yeah, we have our issues, no doubt, but considering that, there was a time when 1 in 3 infants didn't make it past childbirth,
Right.
or tons of women dying in childbirth. The average age was 30, 35, probably lower than that of our ancient ancestors. We have it pretty good, and we have a lot to be optimistic about.
Yeah.
So anyway, so what are some other examples? One thing I wanted to bring to light was, we also have this notion that we humans, basically are just constantly consuming, and don't have this kind of interconnectedness. Like, we don't feel connectedness to nature or anything like that. And a while back, there's a book written by Jared Diamond. It was called The Collapse of Civilization. And one of the things he talked about in that book was what happened to Easter Island. Anyway, Easter Island is an island, like, I don't know, way off the coast of South America. It's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We don't even know how the Polynesians got there, but the Polynesians did get there. And they think they got there somewhere in like 600 AD to 900 AD or whatever. Anyway, at the time, the island was had tons of trees all over it. Island where they built those big statues,
Yep. Yep.
of faces, stone statues that are like 9-12 feet high. Anyway, the story goes, based on the recent old research, is that basically they cut down all the trees, and they basically beat themselves into submission, and very few survived, and they were warring against each other. But what really seems to happen when you really look at the research is that the tree loss was not so much a problem due to humans, but it was actually due to a problem of the Polynesian rat being on the island and brought over by humans, that ate the seeds, and therefore the trees couldn't grow and all that, devastated that. But
Right.
what's very interesting is, even with no trees on that island, the ancestors of these ancient Easterner islanders adapted to the environment of not having trees, and survived to this day. So that's very interesting. And it was only when Europeans came to that island, like Christopher Columbus come to that island, there's documentation that come to that island, and the natives on that island were very friendly towards the Europeans. And it was the Europeans who, kind of brought smallpox and whatever, and wiped most of them out, and also tried to enslave them and bring them back to Peru, and that type of thing. So the mystery of Easter Island was not so much that they killed themselves, but that, they actually worked together to survive on that island.
Yeah.
So I think that's true. So anyway, we're talking about, all right, all the good-natured human stuff and what we do, but what about, what the hell
We've
happened
got some
with
bad
World War
examples.
II?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What about Auschwitz and concentration camps and the Nazis and all this stuff? What about some of the studies out there that
Mm-hmm.
kind of support the other point of view, that humans will just default into this savagery mode?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, one of the grossest examples of human evilness is what happened in Nazi Germany, right?
Absolutely.
And what happens with various genocides throughout the world. We know these things have happened. A lot of that can be brought back to is propaganda, media, and certain groups dehumanizing other groups. But that is not our default mode to do. If left to our own devices and, you know, a random group of, I don't know, Germans and a random group of Jewish people of Jewish descent or outcasts, so to speak, were on this island and they had to work together to survive, they default to their good human nature. You know, it's only when we have this us versus them mentality that kind of gets programmed to us do we default to our savage nature.
Yeah.
And it's scary what we can do, but it's not our default mode. It's not our default mode. There was a study, you've heard of the Stanford prison experiment?
Yeah, that one I am very familiar with.
So anyway, that basically was done with college students, and basically they took groups of college students and signed them up for this experiment. Some were the prison guards, and some were the actual prisoners. And basically the research after they went back and looked at all was completely manipulated. And, the guards received directives how to prisoners from the research study people. So it wasn't, they were kind of directed in how they did things. And
it goes back to that programming.
It was just a sham. Yeah, it goes back to programming and being directed, even though these students all knew they were in being influenced and were involved in an experiment. There was this site where this one example where one of the prisoners, one of these students, has a breakdown, and it was cited in the research as, look what happens to humans. They just break down, and humans the guards seem to enjoy beating up on their fellow humans, yada yada yada. But it just was not true. Actually, what they were trying to do with it was, when you look back through the research, is the guards were being prompted and were trying to help the prisoners, and some of the prisoners would fake breakdowns just so they can go back to class and go studying again. Unfortunately,
it got a famous example of a very flawed study.
Oh, it's a very flawed study. The guy in the study, the researcher was trying to prove the realistic conflict theory, which is basically, our default mode is savagery, which is not true. There's another experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment. And this experiment is what they took young boys that were, average little boys. And they, I think there were two groups of 11 boys, and they brought them to this camp. And they wanted to see the team mentality. Well, one group as soon as these groups of little boys got together, they all hit it off. They were all friends, and they wanted to do things together, and they played team sports. Then when they tried to pit the two groups together, they didn't want to fight about it. They wanted to, the boys were like prompted to, let's make friends with them, yada yada. But it got manipulated and put into the research, and was so biased by the researchers that it also became a flawed experiment. Yeah. So these experiments, based on the ethics of them, especially the prison experiment, it's hard to replicate, to really get an idea of what is going on. But when they did try to replicate it, what they found was the prisoners and the prison guards just try to be friends and make do and do what they had to do to bide their time to get out of there,
Yeah.
And so they try to make everybody happy. So
the IRB would definitely not allow it today.
No, they wouldn't. And then you hear tons of examples of, people. I don't know if you heard this. I've heard this before, but there's a very specific case of where, somebody is, you're walking down a street in New York, and somebody's screaming for help. And that, what do humans do? The default mode is just to walk by and not do anything, right? And there's a woman, very famous case. Her name was Susan Genovese, who got murdered out on the street somewhere in New York. And it was written up by the media that why didn't anybody help her? Everybody heard all these screams, and and everything else, and why didn't anybody make calls or whatever. And when you really delved into it, actually people did try to help her and all that, and it was really the cops and the emergency personnel who didn't think much of it, and didn't get there in time to help save her. I mean, so in general, humans do not, you may see something, most humans, if you see something bad going on, maybe you don't want to get involved because you want to save your own life, which may be a good thing, but most people are going to do what they can to try to help by either calling the police or saying, what happened, because in this case of Tendencies, they were wondering, well, why didn't anybody call the police? Well, they found when they look back through the records, people actually did when they heard this screaming. If somebody's screaming, will somebody check it out?
Right.
So it just wasn't ignored.
Yeah.
So that's the gist of the book, and there's more, and maybe we'll go into these books more at another podcast. But I think it's really interesting that we need to get away from. I think it does not serve us to have this underlying subconscious belief that and again, it stems from maybe Darwinism, that survival of the fittest is what we're all about. It's really not that. I mean, we as a species would not be here without each other cooperating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like it does come from Darwinism, or that mentality definitely grew from that.
Right. And I think it stems, that's part of the issue. It stems from that. And then also, there's a lot of blame to go on around. One of the downsides to religion is, it can consciously or subconsciously, in a lot of people, create an us versus them mentality. Oh, you don't believe in my God, therefore you're not good enough. Therefore, I can dehumanize you, and therefore, ultimately, guess what? I can kill you.
Right.
Because I'm better than. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the people in that in group of religion work better in a group, and are friendliest amongst their group. And I think that's the issue here, is that we need to redefine what our group is, and how about redefining our group as humanity.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask Keoni, what do you think as far as the internet? Do you think that has increased this us versus them mentality, or that we more so see each other, as a whole group of humanity, like you were just saying there?
Man, it's a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Because
obviously,
what's going
truth in the
on?
middle.
Oh, well, it is, because what's very interesting, we are the experiment with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as, this is very interesting, as soon as Twitter and Facebook and all that shut down the tweets of Donald Trump and some of these white nationalists, white supremacist groups, or even shut down some of the social media postings of interfering foreign governments, guess what happened? Social media all of a sudden seems to be a much better place. And we see that happening. You don't see the conspiracy theories going around as much. So on one hand, you really have to watch out and really be able to discern truth from fiction, and use some logic and critically think about what is going on. And I think if people really go back to the default, the true default of humanity, and go, in general, humans are good.
Yeah.
I don't know why this post is being there, but in general, whoever posted it is probably a good person.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's triggering me. On the other side, now, as far as me in social media, and maybe you follow me on some of my posts, I know I can definitely be very opinionated in my views about what I say, but I am going to do my best. I mean, I'm going to tell you what I think about. If somebody says something stupid, I will say that, but it's up to you whether you want to take that person or not. But I'm certainly not going to go out of my way to dehumanize somebody and call them names and say, oh, you're bad because you I don't know, because you believe in whatever.
Yeah.
I like the debate of it and the discussion of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think the discussion of different points of view is ultimately, even if it's just me and you talking here and nobody listens to us, I do think me and you will carry that conversation that we've had on and bring it to other parts of our lives that I think will benefit other people that we come in contact with. I believe that that's part of our legacy. I see that social media as being that. And I think social media was initially put out there for that, even though it gets bastardized as soon as you start, doing this us versus them type thing. Republicans, Democrats, Americans versus Chinese, Russians versus Americans, Muslims, are bad, Mexicans are bad. No, we're all humans and we all have the same basic default pattern of going back to our true human nature, which is generally good. Yeah. We just have to watch ourselves and remind ourselves that we can be bamboozled into believing somebody else is bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this brings us to democracy, right? How does democracy work? I mean, you want debate and democracy. You do not want one group ruling and being the ones to always get to put their belief system into place. Right. You need opposing points of view to progress along, and this is why democracy is such a is such a good thing. But also, democracy is very fragile, where it can be taken over by strong men and manipulated to somebody's will.
Mm-hmm. Create that us versus them mentality.
Like as it was seen in Nazi Germany, right? Where how can a whole country of German people go along with what went on in Nazi Germany? Well, a lot of them may have believed the propaganda that was going on. There's an us versus them mentality. A lot of it was nationalistic, and then some people felt like their hands were tied behind their back. But can anybody truly say Germans are bad people? That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Even though I know there's a lot of shame with that. And right now, I think there's a lot of shame in this country especially with what happened with storming of the Capitol, with the groups who did that. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of them are experiencing a lot of shame with that. I mean, you see that with people who took part in that, that felt like they were bamboozled into, believing a lot of this stuff, without taking a step back. And I just wonder if it would ever happened if people would have just took a step back, go, you know what? In general, people are good, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Keoni,
that's too logical and rational. Jesus. Slowing down and thinking.
But see, I do think humans can learn to be that, even though we are highly manipulated by emotions, right?
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
And which can make us irrational.
Yeah.
Right. But I do think if we take a step back and take a few breaths, we can get in touch more with our good nature and our rational side.
Let me just ask you, Keoni, on the flip side of that, I feel like I'm 27 years old. I feel like I might be subject to some irrationality via my emotions at times. As you've kind of grown up and aged, what are some of the ways that you have kind of combated that yourself, or, domesticated yourself in that regard? Is it having, like, you do a great job of, like you were saying, on social media, of kind of cultivating various opinions for people to express themselves. And even me and Jeremy, who's been on the podcast before with the cryptocurrency episode, I think he commented on something and someone was chewing him out on one of your posts, and you were just like, oh, Jeremy can have his opinion, he's my friend. And it's just right. What have you done to kind of detach or remove yourself from that kind of emotional programming that we do have, or we're susceptible to?
Two of my main things. I read a lot. So I get to read, and I love reading. Yeah, and I read other points of view. I like to read other points of view. Every book that you pick up is somebody's point of view, and it's a valid point of view, for the most part, but at least you get to see other people's points of view, which helps you to be a better critical thinker. And the other thing is I really enjoy dialogue and debate, and that's why I like social media, because it's an outlet for me. And part of the reason why I like this podcast. So when humans can communicate with each other, we do better, right? It's like, where does road rage happen? Does it happen when you're in the car, or does it happen when you're actually face to face with somebody? When do you choose somebody out and go off on them? Is it over the phone, or is it when you're actually face to face? Most times over the phone, or when you have a steel cage like a car wrapped around you, do people lose their shit. You know, but as soon as people can be confronted with their humanity and see the facial expressions of others, it tones the rhetoric way down, you know, and you get a better understanding. So dialogue and reading, I mean, really. And I think, you know, ask anybody. I think somebody who's well, first of all, somebody who is a deep thinker, or thinks about these things, or does podcasts like we do, I think are well read and enjoy the dialogue and enjoy like really trying to understand our humanity.
And another point of view.
And I think that and another point of view, and look forward to that point of view. And all point of views are not immune to debate, and they should be debated. Yeah. Like I make it very clear in social media that I think, you know, I think religion in the organized sense is just ridiculous. That's my point of view. It's an opinion. It's one opinion of many. I feel like it's one of those things that could bring out the us versus them mentality and humanity. And I think history has shown that, but it's debatable. The other side of the coin is, okay, so if you take religion away from other people, what do they have? What do they have to hold on to? I say humanity, but if you don't have something to hold on to and a guiding moral compass, what can you devolve into? Could you devolve into nationalistic dictator rhetoric that kind of, you know, creates a dictator that's now the god that kind of happened in Nazi Germany or Russia in the communist era where Stalin killed millions of people, or the what was it, the killing fields, I think, in Cambodia and stuff like that. I think people need to have something to hold on to. I think my faith, and I think it's proven with science, lies with humanity. And I think these books like This Humankind kind of say, you know, we need to have a little bit more faith in our humanity of each other. And that's why, for me, humanism as a worldview is very attractive. Yeah. It's one worldview. It's one worldview. I mean, there's many, and most people have, you know, pick smatterings of different things. I mean, you can be a humanist and be very Christian. You can be Christian and be very open to other religions, and so on and so on. I'd be the first to admit that, you know. Yeah. But I also am a fervent believer that when things need to get done in this world, I'm not going to rely on a God to get it done. I'm going to rely on my fellow humans for comfort. I'm going to rely on my fellow humans to get shit done, no matter what my beliefs are. Like, as far as the climate change stuff, I'm not going to sit there and go to a corner and pray to a God when it's ultimately humanity, whether they believe in a God or not, has to make this world a better place. And dialogue and reading, I think, are two big things that you can do on your own that will do it.
Awesome. Anything else, Keoni?
No, that's it. Thanks for letting me be in my soapbox, Brian, once again.
No, that was great. It was very interesting. It was poignant for me too. So thank you, everyone, for listening. We will chat with you next week, and we look forward to it. Until then, be well.
Take care, everybody. Bye.